and informed vote, and that you discuss with friends and family what really matters in this 2022 election. Kooyong, your vote counts now more than ever on climate.
And I take this opportunity to assure this audience that Lighter Footprints has no connection to the Labor, Greens, or Independent campaign. We've placed an empty chair on the stage to mark Mr. Frydenberg's absence and to highlight our disappointment at his unwillingness to engage with you and be accountable to you, the voters of Kooyong.
Hi everyone, I'm Mia and I'm a Year 11 at Melbourne Girls College in Richmond. I'm happy to say that I've always been aware of the environment. My parents are both very passionate about sustainability and my school runs a number of environmentally minded initiatives each year. However, as I've grown up, I've realised there's a big difference between being aware of something and caring about it, and another step again to start taking action. When I first walked into an MGC Environment Club meeting, I was there for something to do. Of course, 12-year-old me knew nothing about, was aware of climate change and pollution and animal extinction, but these problems seemed so far away from my everyday life. As you can tell, I couldn't have been more wrong. Enviro Club gave me an opportunity to learn and to listen and to understand what was going on around me, and I quickly realised that the more you know, the more you care. I started getting involved, small things like cutting down on single-use plastics, and then bigger things like skipping school to protest for climate action. I'm hoping some of you have heard of the School Strike for Climate, but for those of you who perhaps haven't, every couple of months, tens of thousands of students and like-minded people gather in Treasury Gardens and other places around the world to show our leaders that we care about our planet and our futures. The support and strength I've seen at these climate strikes has shown me the power of community, that if individual people band together, maybe our political leaders will listen, and that it's possible to make a difference. However, there's only so much us kids can do. We're not old enough to vote, and we have to yell at the old Treasury building in order to be listened to. That's why your support in this upcoming election is so important. And we too need to band together as a community in order to make a difference. Thank you and enjoy the night.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Harle, and I'm a Year 12 student at Strathcona Girls Grammar in Canterbury. My parents have always fostered a love of nature throughout my life, always encouraging my brother and I to learn about the world around us. Throughout secondary school, I have been engrossed in learning about the planet and how we influence our planet. During my studies of Year 12 geography with Miss Fields last year, I studied the many factors contributing to the degradation of our planet and the grim impacts that climate change was having around the world. While learning about the melting glaciers in Greenland, the widespread deforestation in Cameroon, and the desertification of the Sahel region, it struck me that the people in local areas were coming together to protect their environment. These formidable activists and organisers come from countries where poverty runs rife and life expectancy is terribly low. This begs the question, why do we as an extremely wealthy country with the means to support people through the transition repeatedly fail to do our bit to reduce climate change? Global warming and environmental degradation do not only affect people across the seas, but in our own backyard, we have seen firsthand how the changing climate can take lives and livelihoods. The bushfires that burned for an unprecedented amount of time, the drought that devastated our regions, and now floods across the country. These impacts are not endemic to a certain geographic location or social group. Climate change can and will affect everyone. During my studies of economics this year, I have formed the view, which is shared by many leading economists and academics, that the shift away from fossil fuels is an opportunity to harness our wealth and vast resources and to secure future prosperity. The shift towards a secure future for my generation and the generations to come does not have to cause as much pain as some say it will. In fact, with the right planning today, we can further grow the economy and become a worldwide leader in renewable energy tomorrow. All around our country, there are everyday heroes doing their bit to create a brighter future. But these people can only do so much. That is why we need to ensure that our Commonwealth Government is the one leading the charge for a better tomorrow. We need a pragmatic, concrete plan that all Australians can unite behind, that will secure a better future for the generations to come. So, on that note, I look forward to hearing from the candidates tonight on their plan for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you Mick and Lynn for the welcome here. And this is a pretty incredible moment actually. It's wonderful to look out at a completely full house and high up there on the balcony, and hi to everybody watching at home on Facebook. This doesn't happen in every electorate. On a Wednesday night, in the week after a long weekend, to have hundreds of people turn up to support democracy, to talk about climate change, go Kooyong. I feel like we should just leave it to you lot and the rest of us can go home. Speaking of you lot, how many of you are from Kooyong? Hands up if you're from Kooyong. Okay, well take a look around. Keep your hands up and have a look around. So if anyone suggests that this is not a local outfit and that this is not a local campaign, you just remind them what happened in this room tonight, because this is overwhelmingly, well over 90% local people. So it's wonderful to see you here. And I want to say an enormous thank you to you all for holding our democracy so actively, because we are, as we have just heard, facing an absolute crisis. And it is our responsibility to make a change. No one is coming to save us. This is on us. We need to make the changes. We need to get active. Part of that is how we're going to vote and who's going to stand to represent us and on what issues and how. And so the fact that you are taking hold of this and shaping our future, I really, really do thank you for that and applaud you for it. So we're about to get into the guts of the discussion. We're going to hear from 3 candidates this evening about their positions on climate change and what they are offering to you as voters in this electorate. As we've heard, Mr. Frydenberg has declined the offer to speak with you all this evening. He is represented here on the chair. In his place, all candidates were told that there would be another speaker who would inform us of their policies if they did not attend, and we will be joined by another speaker to give us an overview of Mr. Frydenberg and the Liberal Party's policies tonight. Each of the speakers I will introduce, and then I'm going to invite them up onto the stage. They will have 3 minutes to speak to you all. They will get a ding at 2.5 minutes. They'll have 30 seconds left. They'll get another ding at 3 minutes. And my friendly warning, I've been here before, with this crowd before. They really don't like you going over. So I'm just letting you know. After we've heard from each of the candidates, we'll then hear from Alex Currell, who's going to speak to us about the Liberal Party policies and the score, how his independent group has rated those. And then we're moving to Q&A. Now, I've got a couple of questions that the organisers have put forward, but the rest is up to you. I am familiar with your ramshackle ways, and so I'm not going to invite you all to rush to the stage with your questions. Instead, we are using a fabulous online platform called Slido. And you can see the instructions here. Just on your phone, if you just look up Slido, go to the website, it'll ask you for a code. Enter that code there. What have we got? 635875. And it will bring you straight to a whole list of questions that your peers and neighbours have been already putting in there. You can add your own question, you can vote on a question that you like, and I'm going to be checking those questions throughout. So when I'm looking at my phone, I'm not just checking TikTok videos, I'm actually reading your questions and trying to get a feel of the vibe of where you want to go with this conversation. So if there's something that you're passionate about that you want to see asked, get in there, vote up a similar question or put in your own, and we'll be guided by that. We're going to keep it tight tonight. I'm sure some of the candidates might be available for you to have a chat with afterwards. But to keep us moving, let's get right into it. Our first speaker for tonight is Dr Peter Lynch, the ALP candidate for Kooyong. Peter has had a long medical career as a specialist physician, clinical director, public health official, and health services board director. He has worked in a wide variety of clinical management and research positions in Victoria, the Northern Territory, and in the UK private and public sectors for the last 40 years. He has been a senior public health official in Victoria and a member of the Commonwealth Pharmaceutical Benefits Committee and the National Health and Medical Research Council. Peter is passionate about a healthy environment, better health and education, recognition of First Nations peoples, and Australia's role in the Asia Pacific. Peter and his wife Liz have 5 children and 7 grandchildren. Welcome, Peter.
Acknowledge the traditional owners. With 3 minutes, I'd like to move rapidly into the policy presentation. I'd like to put to you that Federal Labor Party has got a strong environmental perspectives over the last 50 years. Environmentalism and climate action is now in the Labor Party policy DNA. The current national ALP platform states that action on climate change is a core Labor value. The ALP platform also acknowledges an existential threat that represented by climate change and calls on the party to move into emergency phase. As Leo has touched on, there's been some strong action on climate change from businesses and from states, governments, and I acknowledge the local government here, Burundara, has come on board in the last year. There's been no state government that's been better than Victorian government. I think that's widely acknowledged. Very strong policies on climate change. That's what a Labor government looks like in action. That's the policy DNA going through to the messenger RNA of being in government. So since 2001, Federal Labor at every election has presented strong policies on climate change in the Rudd government, the Gillard government. Labor's presented strong policies at the elections of 2004, which were lost. That cost us the Kyoto Protocol for 3 years until the Rudd government was elected. In the last 2 elections, strong climate action policies were presented, but Labor was not successful. In government from 2007 to 2010, the Rudd government attempted the first emissions trading scheme. It was actually blocked by the Greens Party and minor parties. Subsequently, there was an election in 2010. The Gillard government established the basic architecture and framework of climate change management, which has been touched on. The establishment of an emission trading scheme was presented in this very hall by Anna Burke, the then member for Chisholm. Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Climate Change Authority, ARENA, the Commission, and so on. In 2013, the Abbott coalition government abolished most of it. It was the policy to try and abolish it all. Fortunately, they were not successful, and parts of the architecture survived, such as the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Labor's has, since losing the last election, has developed policies aimed at climate change slowly through the period, culminating in the presentation of Powering Australia on the 3rd of December. I'll just briefly go through some of the key aspects. Overall, the policy is aimed at increasing the share of renewables to 82%. Was that the bell? And reducing emissions by 43% by 2030, en route to a net emissions zero by 2050. This establishing the rewiring the corporation, rewiring the nation corporation, the solar banks policy, the establishment of the community batteries policy, and I'm hoping to have time to elaborate on these later. Converting, is that the bell? There's extensive policies on industry and carbon farming. Look, overall, I would probably highlight the big change is going to be leadership, national leadership, ending the divisive process, and legislating both 2050 target and 2030 target of 43%, advising COP that these are the new targets, restoring the role of the Climate Change Authority, new annual reporting mechanisms to Parliament, the establishment of a climate change ambassador, and the offer to host the COP 2029. So Labor will establish the architecture of managing climate change. And 3 minutes goes quickly.
Like a long way up here. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to Lighter Footprints for hosting this evening. It's just so important, and it's a real honour for me to be here. I think as has been made very clear tonight, without fast and deep emissions cuts, we are racing towards a world where vast areas of the globe become uninhabitable, where we see widespread ecological and biological systems collapse, where we possibly trigger one or more irreversible tipping points that set in a train of runaway global heating beyond our control. In the face of this advice, any government, in making good on its core duty to provide for the security, the well-being and the prosperity of its people, would be scrambling to do all that it could to avert that disaster. Yet, our government, including the man who should be in that empty chair, is doing exactly the opposite, proudly declaring almost on a daily basis its commitment to opening more coal mines and gas wells that would have catastrophic consequences for global heating. Personally, I don't think there is an example in human history where a government has responded to an impending crisis, not by taking measures to avert or mitigate that crisis, but by acting in a way that accelerates it. I just can't. But there is hope. There is a new way forward, and that's this. If we follow the best available science and show the highest possible level of ambition, we can keep global warming to 1.5 degrees and avert a crisis. In Australia, our best scientists, including those at the Climate Council and the Climate Targets Panel, have told us that for Australia, this obligation means this: cutting emissions by 75% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2035, and keeping coal and gas in the ground where it belongs. And this scientific process is exactly what the Greens are promising. If you put us in the balance of power, we'll put a moratorium on all new coal and gas projects the day after the election. We'll move quickly to decarbonise our economy by using wind and solar, and we'll end thermal coal by the end of the decade. And we'll ensure that it is a just transition, so that those that are directly affected by this transition to renewables are taken forward in a just and equitable way and do not lose out. Taking these steps and adopting these emissions targets isn't the perfect getting in the way of the good. It's the only way we can do our bit to avoid a crisis. Any candidate or leader who suggests we should adopt targets south of this number should explain why. And to be clear, the economic opportunities of this transition are enormous. The pathway to a livable future is clear and we can get there. We just need to show the necessary political ambition. We've got an awful lot to lose by not taking the right action, and we've got everything to gain if we do. Let's make our kids proud and let's shoot for the stars. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening. Firstly, I'll acknowledge that this vast and beautiful land was never ceded to us and that we owe its first owners our respect. In the last 2 years, we've understood more than ever before the importance of a community. Today, we stand together as a community, united by our concern about the most immediate and significant threat to our economic and our environmental security: human-induced climate change. We're the converted. I don't need to preach to you about the stuff that you already know. We know all that stuff already. What I need to do is to convince you that in voting for me, you will have an extraordinary opportunity to change the course of Australian climate history, and that this singular opportunity cannot and must not be wasted. The evidence is clear. Climate change caused by burning fossil fuels is a threat to all of us and to all of the species on this wonderful planet. Further delays in global climate action will result in us missing the opportunity to slow and then reverse its effects. We'll also miss the economic opportunities that this new vision offers, one based on a clean energy future, which is accelerating in other countries around the world. We know that Australia has enormous potential to move from what are becoming stranded fossil fuel assets to becoming an economic superpower by making renewable energy a priority for this country. Respected business analysts like Accenture have estimated that we could have 395,000 jobs and $89 billion in revenue by 2040 through renewable energy export opportunities, hydrogen, ammonia, steel, minerals critical for the production of zero-emissions energy and transport technologies, production and export of batteries manufactured in Australia. This afternoon, I was really pleased to be able to announce a policy on electric vehicles in which I've committed to legislate on vehicle emission standards, provide a $5,000 rebate for electric vehicles, and support manufacture of electric vehicle batteries in Australia. Many of the jobs created thus will be in regional communities which are currently exposed by the transition away from fossil fuels. Our government has failed to demonstrate the vision that we need for effective action on climate change. We deserve better and we can have better. With an independent on the crossbench, you will have a local member with life experience and pragmatism who will listen to you and who will act on your concerns. A local member absolutely committed to action on climate change for the next generation and the generation after that. This time, you need to vote on climate change and integrity, on the issues that matter the most to us. If you do that, Kooyong will rise to an independent. You deserve better. You should have better, and you will have better.
Thanks, Victoria, and hello, everyone. My aim in this talk is to give you a brief but accurate summary of the 5 key Liberal climate policies we assist for the Kooyong Climate Scorecard. I'll explain even more briefly why we rated them as poor in all cases, the lowest score on our scale. The first area we scored was the candidates' recognition of the climate emergency. The importance of this recognition is obvious. It provides a context for all other climate policies and some assurance that even if there are gaps in the solutions offered, at least the magnitude of the problem is recognised. Unfortunately, there's no reference to the climate emergency in Liberal policy, nor any attempt to convey the need for urgent action. The next policy area we considered was the 2030 emissions target. As I'm sure you're aware, the Liberals' target is to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels. Despite stating that we're on track for a reduction of up to 35% by 2030, the Liberals have declined to increase their Abbott-era target. In the context of the Climate Council's recommendation of a 75% reduction, or even the less ambitious targets of other OECD countries, this target is clearly inadequate. Our third scoring area was the transition to renewables, with the main focus on the national electricity grid. The Liberals describe their plan for net zero as technology-driven and commit to $22 billion of government investment in low emissions technology to 2030. Unfortunately, the definitions are so loose that carbon capture and storage and production of hydrogen from fossil fuels are included as priorities. But the investment also prioritises solar generation and energy storage, and stretch goals for reduced costs have been set for both. Technology deployment is to be private sector led, with barriers to the integration of more renewables in the grid addressed by major government investments, including Snowy 2.0, the Marinas Link interconnector, and other grid improvements. However, at the same time, the Liberals are actively promoting new gas generation, underwriting a new 660 megawatt open cycle gas turbine in New South Wales. And the hollowness of the overall grid transition plan is clear in the projection that it will result in only 85% renewable generation in 2050, with a significant proportion of gas and some remaining coal in the electricity grid. This in the context of a renewables proportion of close to 100% in 2030 in one of the energy market operators' plausible future scenarios. The fourth area we looked at was electric vehicle policy. Here, the Liberals' central focus is on charging infrastructure and the EV readiness of the grid. An expanded $250 million future fuels fund and changes to the emissions reduction fund are designed to leverage private investment. However, there is no policy to tighten emission standards, reduce EV costs for consumers, or plan to phase out new petrol vehicle sales. The projection once again highlights the weakness of the policy. Only 30% of new vehicle sales would be EVs or hybrid by 2030. This compares with the UK government commitment to phase out sales of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. The final area we considered was fossil fuel mining. Here the picture is very simple. The Liberals support continued fossil fuel mining and have no policy to phase out coal and gas production. The gas-fired recovery is central to government thinking. It includes major government investment to support new gas extraction through the Future Gas Infrastructure Investment Framework. Earlier this month, the Commonwealth and Northern Territory governments signed an $872 million deal to accelerate development of the Beetaloo Gas Basin, including $660 million of federal funding. This is only the first of 5 gas basins identified for future development. This policy flies in the face of the International Energy Agency's pathway to net zero, which recommends no investment in new fossil fuel supply. In addition to these 5 climate policy areas, we also analysed and scored 2 governance-related policies, a Federal Integrity Commission and political donations law reform. We felt these needed to be included because of the clear link between failures in governance and failures in climate policy. I won't go into the details here, but we found the Liberals' policies in both these areas to be seriously wanting, just as they are in the more specifically climate-related areas. If you're so inclined, you can find much more about all these policies and those of the other candidates, as well as full details of our scoring rationale on the Kooyong Votes Climate website. Thank you very much.
Everyone's got their own? Could we just hand one over?
I'll have
Thank
Josh's.
you.
I don't think he needs them.
It was cheap, but it was there. Sorry.
It was there. We're moving into the Q&A now. I've been watching your questions come on in. Remember to use Slido, get in there, be voting them up, put in your own questions. We want to hear from you in this. But as I mentioned, we do have a couple of questions that were prepared by the organisers of this evening, and I'm going to start with those. And it would be remiss not to have read the papers in the last couple of days and realised that targets are back in the headline. As much as we might want to move on from climate targets, because it seems to be the debate constantly, there seems to be quite a bit of debate about whether parties' targets are holding or not. Now, the Climate Council asserts that for Australia to contribute its fair share to the world's effort to keep warming below 2 degrees, it must reduce its carbon emissions by 75% below 2005 levels by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2035. So I'll ask each of the candidates in turn, and I'll start with you, Peter. What are your emission reduction targets for 2030 and 2035, and do they represent a fair contribution from Australia?
The targets are as outlined in the Powering Australia policy. The Powering Australia policy is substantiated by the Reputex modelling, and the Labor policy stands on the fact that it actually can be done and can be implemented. So, as I've stated, and Chris Bowen's been quite clear about this, firstly, net zero by 2050 will be legislated. Now, up to a couple of days ago, some people would have said, well, so what, and, you know, blah, blah. But as you can see from the last few days, that's not all that irrelevant. Secondly, the 2030 target of 43% will also be legislated, and COP will be advised of those targets. So they are the targets. They are not ceilings. They are not caps. They're modelled targets. I understand my two friends here can talk of higher targets, but I believe this election should be a contest and a contest between the chances of implementation, the chances of being elected, and the chances of implementing these full policies. For a Labor government to do this, they need to win the majority in the House of Representatives. There's 151 seats. That means Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory, etc. So yes, the strength, I believe, of the Labor targets are the implementability of it, and the potency of it, I think, has also been highlighted in the last few days, of the safeguards mechanism, which was in the policy in December, and I would highlight that the major gas and coal companies will be under that umbrella. It's highly likely that the smart people in those companies will take that very, very seriously. The business cases will be a completely different situation to what's been, and those companies will most likely make the sensible decision not to go ahead with some of these projects. So they either buy very expensive offsets or they don't go ahead with some of these developments.
Thank you, Peter. To you, Piers.
Yes, those targets are exactly what the Greens have adopted as their emissions targets. So 75% reduction in emissions on 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2035. Those targets have been set because they've been assessed as reflecting what Australia needs to do to ensure that it's consistent, acting consistently with avoiding catastrophic climate change. And that's exactly why the Greens have adopted them. And they're achievable. We can get there. So yes, we should be adopting them. And I'm very, very proud to be standing up here today talking to those targets.
Thank you, Piers. Monique, up to you.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it's not like we can turn a dial to -50 or -60 or -75. The move to reduce our emissions is a complex one that requires a lot of infrastructural and other development. So I'm a pragmatist. I have committed to supporting Zali Steggall's Climate Change Action Bill, which looks at a target of 60% by 2030. And the reason for that is pretty simple, that bill is ready to go to Parliament as soon as possible after May the 21st. And it will kickstart that process before the end of this year. And we know that the faster we get going with that process, the better we'll do. There's only 7 budgets between now and 2030. We've got a lot of work to do between now and then. And so something that can be started immediately, kick-started then, and then hopefully built on, to surpass that 60% target is where I've gone, because I think that that's the most rational, pragmatic, reasonable way of achieving immediate action on climate change in this country in this year.
Thank you. If you are elected to Parliament, you will be there to create legislation. And so what piece of climate-focused legislation is your #1 priority to get passed in this 47th Parliament of Australia? Starting with you, Peter.
Well, all of it. Well, all of it, if I understand the question correctly.
So I love your ambition that you think that you would get all of it through, but
Well, with
in
a majority
reality,
Labor government, we will.
There's always a bit of a reality check on that. What is the piece that's the priority for you that you would be fighting to get through in this next Parliament?
Yeah, look, I really find it hard to pick out one bit or another. I mean, the leadership issues which I mentioned, the legislating the targets, the implementation of all the policy, the whole suite of issues of policies in the Powering Australia policy, the electric vehicles, which actually will be starting on July 1. The electric vehicle discount in the Labor policy, plus the starting and rolling out of electrical vehicle strategy. So there are 2 taxation changes which will start in about 60 days. So that would be the most urgent one, I suppose, in times. But I'm afraid I see them all equally important.
Thank you, Peter. Piers.
So our first move, which we made very clear by Bant a few weeks ago, is that we want to see a moratorium on all new coal and gas infrastructure and developments from the day after the election. And that will be our starting position. Beyond that, we will move rapidly to legislate the targets that I've just spoken about, because the targets are the centrepiece of all your policy. You start with the targets and then you build your policy around it so you know where you're heading and you know how you're going to get there. Without a 75% target for 2030, we are raising the white flag to catastrophic climate change. So the first legislative measure that I would personally be pushing for is a 75% target, to hold our government to account, to push the Labor Party to go further and faster on climate change, and to help avert the climate crisis. So that's exactly what I would do. Thank you.
Yes, as I said, I would go with Zali Steggall's Climate Change Action Bill. It would have gone to Parliament in the last electoral cycle had the Liberal National Party not blocked that. It's ready to go. It sets out a pathway to a 60% reduction in emissions by 2030. It's well developed and mature, and it would set the ball going in the direction we need it to go within the next 6 months. Oh, and plus, though, I would add on the things that the parts of the policy that I announced today for electric vehicles, which aren't actually in that, but would dovetail perfectly with a number of the initiatives that are in that bill already.
Thank you. Moving now on to a couple of questions that have come through from the audience, and I'm just going to be picking out from themes that I'm picking up through here. So if you're not in there yet, get in, have a vote, put your question in. We have seen big money influence elections, and influence action on climate change over the last couple of decades in Australia. In fact, the flows of big money through politics and influencing across Australian society has been a really significant challenge. What would you do to get big donations from fossil fuel companies out of the political system and bring greater integrity to our democracy? And I'm going to start with you, Monique.
Thanks, Victoria. So, I mean, I think the best example of that was that at the last election, someone said to me, oh, Clive Palmer's not very smart. You know, he spent all this money on the election and he only got one person up. And my response to that was he spent $81 million and then was in a position to lever the Liberal National Party to approve a $5.4 billion project in the Galilee Basin. He's not a stupid man. There's a reason why he's spending $121 million on this election. And you know, we can guess what he's hoping to achieve from that. So I look, as have many of the other independents who are standing in this election, I'm already committed to action on political donation reform. It's not quite as simple as just changing the rules around who can give what and when, because we know that the problems in the system are much more entrenched and nasty, and actually there's a lot more corruption in that system than we've appreciated before. There's lots of sneaky ways that the fossil fuel companies and the mining companies can get money to the major parties behind closed doors. And unfortunately, they do that. But I have signed up to a pledge to be committed to immediate and effective action on electoral donation reform in this country. I think it's extremely important and something that we all deserve.
Piers.
So the best way to get fossil fuel money out of politics is to straight up ban donations to political parties, and that's exactly what we are undertaking to do. I take a slightly different view on this matter to Dr Ryan in that it is possible to ban these donations and to do that effectively because the Greens Party does it already. We do not take a single dollar from the fossil fuel industry or the gambling industry or the defence industry or the pharma industry, and we can apply that. We can apply that across the board, and honestly, I personally believe that is the one way to genuine policy, to see genuine across-the-board policy change that actually reflects the needs of the people instead of the needs of those in power and their fossil fuel mates. That is the best way that we can ensure that policy reflects our needs, because at the moment it feels like we need a royal commission every time we need some legislative change that actually reflects the needs of the population. So banning fossil fuel donations, yes, it is achievable, yes, we can do it, and we'd absolutely seek to do that. We'd also make every donation to a political party of $1,000 or more fully transparent and disclosable. Again, that's what the Greens Party already do.
The Labor platform, the LP National Platform, is committed to integrity of the electoral system. Labor in Parliament has already actually introduced in the Senate a bill to reduce political donation disclosure to $1,000. It was blocked by the other parties in the Senate, major and minor, and has also introduced a bill in the Senate to require political disclosure of political donations to the AEC within 7 days of receipt. Personally, I'm totally committed to integrity in politics and integrity in political donations and transparency. So I strongly support these measures. They will be announced formally again during this formal election campaign. I also support, and I don't know if it's going to be in the official launch, but I also support a limitation of expenditure per candidate in elections. And whatever other interesting things the Kooyong campaign is certainly an interesting case study of lack of electoral transparency of political donations.
It's not just big money. There is another nefarious force at play in climate politics in Australia, which has proven to be the media at times. Not always nefarious to those media agencies in the room tonight. Charmed to have you here, of course. Given the implications of the Australian media ownership on climate outcomes and the way this has played out in Australia in recent years, what is your policy for media ownership in Australia? And Piers, I'm going to start with you.
So media ownership at the moment is highly concentrated in the Murdoch media empire. I think we all know that. We've seen the results of that. I think certainly the people up on stage have probably experienced firsthand the effect of the Murdoch media empire as well. We want a royal commission into them, into media dominance and their behaviour and their stranglehold over the political process at the moment. We want to see the media market opened up to new media companies so there's greater diversity in Australia and a greater range of views, because that can only enrich democracy. And fundamentally, we also want to see that the ABC and SBS are properly funded. No more funding cuts. Nothing is more important to the integrity of our democracy and the strength of our democracy than those two institutions. So one of the first things we will do is restore that funding and put it beyond the reach of politicians who are trying to corrupt that process and undermine democracy.
Monique, to you.
Look, I have experienced at first hand in recent weeks the power of the Murdoch press, and have, I think, appreciated for the first time the extent to which our political process is subjugated to the Murdoch press, which is a really unfortunate thing. I fully agree with Piers that we need a Royal Commission into the media, but I don't think it should be a witch hunt just into the Murdoch media. I think there's other things that we need to look at as well. Digital media in this country is problematic, and the regulation around it is problematic. The way that the government abandoned the Australian network in Southeast Asia and the Pacific in recent years has had immediate implications for our national security, and I think we've lost our relationship with the Solomons and countries like that as well. So what the federal government needs to look at is its responsibility to Australian citizens, but also to citizens in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and what our media needs to look like going forward. A Royal Commission is probably the best way to do that, I'd agree, but I think it has to have a fairly broad remit.
Thank you, Monique. And Peter.
Labor is strongly committed to the ABC and SBS. Specific policy has been released on this. It's on the LP website. The critical thing is Labor will introduce 5-year funding for the ABC, so it'll break this, the Tony Abbott, no cuts to the SBS, no cuts to the ABC, next budget, cut the lot, and did worse, as we discussed at our arts forum down at the bookshop. So I think that's there'll be increased funding. They'll put some of the funding cuts back, but give ABC and SBS more certainty about planning and production. I totally agree with Monique. Look, I've had personal experience in the remote areas of Papua New Guinea and East Timor with ABC, and so I've cut some of those services, particularly the shortwave radio, which I've actually experienced crackling up in the most remote areas, was a terrible thing, and undoubtedly the situation in the Solomons, it's at least partly contributed to it. Labor yesterday presented a strong policy on the Pacific. It includes restoration of ABC services, better ABC services, and including climate change actions for the South Pacific. And one of the leadership things, which I didn't have time to mention, is there'll be a conference in partnership with the Asia Pacific nations if Labor's elected to government on climate change strategies.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the impacts of climate change don't impact everybody equally, and some people are far more impacted by both the direct impacts as well as the changes that are taking place to hopefully address this crisis. In particular, women's, Indigenous and diverse people's rights are systemically linked with the climate crisis. How will you urgently and cohesively address this link? So what will you be able to do, and what are you doing to prioritise the needs of these diverse communities in our climate response? Peter.
Well, Labor actually led the way. Our friend here copied this in the budget on Indigenous ranges and environmental protection areas. So again, the Labor policy is very strong, recognising the expertise and experience of Indigenous ranges. It's something I had personal experience with in Northern Territory. I was absolutely delighted when it went into the Labor platform. Labor's got a strong policy on recognition of First Nations persons, Uluru Statement of the Heart, a whole range of policies, reconciliation, truth-telling, Makarrata, and constitutionally a voice to Parliament. So that's a very strong policy, and the Indigenous rangers actually have a lot of expertise, and the Indigenous cultures can actually make great contributions to country. I'm also, from my Northern Territory experience, very touched by the effects of climate change in Central Australia. Most people will first mention the barrier reefs, which actually is an international, not just a national issue. But the situation in Central Australia is quite poignant, and with worsening climate change, the Central Australia will basically become uninhabitable.
Thank you, Peter. Piers.
This is one of the areas I'm very proud to say we align closely with the Labor Party in terms of Indigenous rangers and making sure that Indigenous cultural land management practices are fully incorporated into the way that we approach our environment and the way that we approach the climate. We want to increase funding in that area and make sure that those land management practices really are fully incorporated. Sometimes I feel like for 90,000 years, our Indigenous brothers and sisters managed this land beautifully and kept it for future generations, and it's taken us, 300 years to unravel it? We need to start listening to them. The second point I'd make is, it sounds a little bit disconnected, but social housing, making sure that people have a shelter and somewhere that they can afford to live, sustainable housing that protects them from the elements. We've got a rental crisis and a housing crisis in this country that disproportionately affects the poor and affects marginalised communities. And as our climate becomes harsher, which it inevitably will, as we see 50-degree days and heat waves become commonplace, which will inevitably happen, we need to make sure that people are properly housed, securely housed, not in precarious accommodation. And that's one of our major policies, is over a 10-year period to build up to 100 million homes to ensure that people have affordable and stable housing. So that's another measure that we will do that will directly benefit, I think, people who are marginalised at the moment.
Monique?
So I guess the first thing to say is that a rising tide will raise all boats. So effective action on climate change will improve all of our outcomes, whether we talk about people who are in those more marginal groups or people who are not. So that's the first thing. We can all take action together to ameliorate those threats. I completely agree that the communities in the north of Australia in particular, the most at threat are the Indigenous communities, and there's much that can be done to help those communities prepare for and mitigate the threats of climate change. Sally Steggall's Climate Change Act actually does look at the rural communities in particular and the extent to which they will be affected by climate change in a predictable way in the next 5 to 10 years, and how we can ameliorate that. I also was going to say, I agree with Piers that housing is a really important issue. Housing standards in this country need to be improved, and all that the public housing that we need to, the social housing that we need to build, needs to be built to appropriate standards, such as to decrease the impact of new housing. And that's not happening right now, and it needs to be funded, and it needs to happen properly. It's a difficult one if we talk about people who are with gender sorts of issues. I think that does sort of conflate with the other marginalised people who need more support. One of my policies is looking at gender imbalance in society in general, looking at things like the fact that the feminised workforces are paid less and have less security and are more at risk from homelessness, from climate change, from all of the above, and those things need to be addressed systematically. But what we really need is a government that doesn't plan for its own re-election every 3 years, but that actually plans for things every 5 years and every 10 years.
Thank you. This transition is going to have a huge impact on working people in Australia. Retraining our labour force will be key to the transition to renewable energy and to the other changes underfoot. How will you support our TAFE sector and ensure clean jobs for Aussie workers?
You're singing our song. So Labor's introduced a strong policy on TAFE, particularly for industries, free TAFE places for industries that require further training. As part of the Powering Australia policy, there are specific commitments to low energy apprenticeships and generally a support for a workforce for the new renewable economy.
Okay, so the first point on TAFE is that we want to tax multinational corporations so they stop shifting their profits overseas and avoiding paying tax billionaires and make TAFE free. That's the first point. And we can do that. With those structural reforms, we can make that affordable and we can achieve it. In terms of this transition, yes, it is going to be a big transition and it will affect people adversely, particularly those in communities built around coal and gas. If we invest properly in TAFE and make retraining available to people, we can transition workers and bring them with us. If we start leaving people behind, we are never going to make it through this transition. We have to go forward together so we can make retraining available to people. The Greens also offer a secure income guarantee. So when you lose your job because your coal mine shuts down or the coal-fired power plant stops burning coal, it's really important that we have a safety net that carries people through this transition. And we've got a plan for that. And we're going to make sure that no worker is left behind. Again, we can afford it if we make these structural reforms to our taxation system. So we're going to bring people forward and ensure that this transition happens together, it happens in an equitable and fair way, and that we can embrace this renewable economy with open arms together as a country.
Look, I think we've all felt that the tertiary education sector has been poorly treated in the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen the impact on the universities and we've seen the impact on the thousands of international students who were abandoned by the federal government during COVID. And that was a shameful episode for all of us. The universities and the TAFEs have really struggled in the last few years and they do need more support, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. Prior to COVID, tertiary education was our third biggest export industry. But I think it's going to take us a long time to recover from the way that we've behaved as a country in the last 3 years. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of jobs in these new technologies. It's going to be a really exciting time. As Piers said, a just transition is incredibly important for those people who are working in fossil fuel industries now, but most of them can be retrained. There's going to be jobs for them and they have expertise which will be transferable. For those who don't want to, then they need to understand to be helped into an early retirement or into retraining for other positions. That's fine, but they just need to have the security and the sense of that, of a timeline for that, in a way that reassures them and their communities of how things are going to be, again, in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time. It can all be done, but what we need is a government that doesn't look for wiggle room, that doesn't backtrack on what it's committed to 6 months ago or 12 months ago. We need a government that commits to these targets and gives people a sense of where we're going to be in 5 years' time, where we're going to be in 10 years' time, and what jobs and what people we're going to need to do that. And once we have that sense of things, then we can plan, the universities can plan, the TAFEs can plan. There'll be lots of tertiary education positions and there'll be heaps of jobs. And we'll all be happy and healthy. Seems to make sense.
Thank you. Unfortunately, as if the climate crisis wasn't enough, it's not the only crisis on our hands. We're also facing an extinction crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And these two themes are very interlinked, and we know the impact on climate change of nature loss, and we know how important it is as a solution. What are you going to do in this next term of Parliament to address our environment and biodiversity and extinction crisis? And I'll start with you, Monique.
Yeah, sadly, we're seeing species become extinct increasingly frequently. And again, that's a shameful situation for us to be in. The first thing we have to do is to stop the warming of our planet. That's the first and the existential threat to the further species. So we have to stop that. And then we have there are pathways in place for us to look at to preserve biodiversity of species. We need to follow the UN pathway for that, which are well established, well developed. And then we need to look at take advantage of the technological and scientific expertise that we have for how to repopulate and regenerate our oceans and our reefs and our forests. But it'll take time, and again, it'll take commitment. It can be done, but it can't be done in a year or 2 or 3 years. It'll take us 5, 10, 15 years to get back some of the damage that we've caused. And we have to commit to doing that together.
Thank you. Piers.
So we'll move very quickly to stop land clearing and to stop the logging of our old growth forests. I think the figure I heard, we've got about 1% of our original mountain ash forest left in Victoria. I think that's about it. That could be wrong, but I think that's roughly the figure. I think probably most of us in the room have been up into the Yarra Ranges or up into the Great Dividing Range, and it's one of the most unique places. So we need to protect it. We will also invest very heavily in protection of biodiversity. Australia is emerging as one of the global hotspots for extinction, and we really need to manage that properly. So we want to invest very, very heavily in greater protection of our species, address feral pest management and improve that, because cats, it's not very fashionable to talk about at the moment, but cats are a major driver alongside land clearing of species extinction, and we need to address feral animal control as well in a big way. Peter.
I agree. Biodiversity is incredibly important. Our species loss is dramatic. It of course reflects dramatic environmental degradation, certainly climate change and climate change policies. A lot of this is state issues though, and the state governments have a very important role in this area. But a range of environmental policies and to protect biodiversity.
I'm going to move to a final question, but I've got a slightly different question for each of you, given you're all vying for this shot to represent these fine people from slightly different positions. So Peter, I'm going to start with you. You're here representing the ALP, who have had their own fair share of internal division around climate policy. And we have seen changing climate policy from within the ALP over the last several years. We've seen steps forward, but we've also seen steps backwards. If you were elected to represent Kooyong on the issues of climate change and our environment, how would the people here trust that you would deliver and deliver in line with those policies and achieve the outcomes you've committed here today?
Well, I'd be a strong advocate for climate change, environmental policies, refugees, First Nations and other issues if I was a Labor member. I know the concept of Petro Georgia has come up during the campaign. Petro Georgia was actually a government backbencher, so I would sort of like to think they would play some sort of a role like that. But yes, I would be a strong advocate for those policies.
Thank you, Peter.
Can I just be a bit cheeky and add there that if you put the Greens into the balance of power, we'll hold them to account. We will make them do it.
That was a bit cheeky, but thank you. Piers, the Greens are often accused of being unrealistic, putting forward policies that push too hard, too fast, and that you're not able to deliver. Why would this scenario be any different, and how would we trust that you would deliver and that you would work constructively to achieve outcomes?
So this narrative that the Greens are unrealistic or that we're the perfect, getting in the way of the good and that we can't deliver, it's a false narrative. It starts back at the CPRS that Bob Brown was instrumental in voting down back in 2009 or 2008, whenever it was. That was really, really bad legislation. That would have allowed our emissions to go up. It would have paid fossil fuel companies to continue belching out gases into our atmosphere and destroying our Earth. He was right to vote that down. When we were last in the balance of power in the Julia Gillard government with Adam Bandt in between 2010 and around 2012, we achieved some really, really meaningful changes. First and foremost with the emissions trading scheme, that's the only time where Australia's emissions have demonstrably gone down thanks to direct government intervention. The only time. And yes, there was Adam Band on the crossbench along with some other independents. I think Rob Oakeshott was one of them. But it was Adam that proposed that emissions trading scheme, and it was under Adam's written agreement with the Gillard government that it was implemented. We also got dental into Medicare for kids. That was a massive reform. We had another number of other structural reforms that we implemented. So I really think this narrative around the Greens being ineffective or chasing the perfect in the way of the good is a false narrative. Coming on to our, I suppose, if I can just say quickly, our climate targets, right? We do have the highest and the strongest, most ambitious climate targets of any candidate or any party at the moment. But that's because we are facing an existential crisis, an existential question. We need to step up and we need to be ambitious. And if we're going to adopt targets that are less than the perfect, we need to explain why. Because we're raising the white flag on climate change if we're doing that. And that's why the Greens are purists there, and I'm proud to say that we are.
Thank you, Piers. Now, Monique, you're running as an independent, so you're getting a double-tiered question here. The first part is similar to the question for Piers. You're running against a sitting member who is long established, not sitting here, admittedly, long established, who is the treasurer, who has a lot of influence to get things done. And you would be, if elected, stepping in as an independent, without the support of a party, without the people around you to necessarily get things done. Why should this audience believe that you could deliver as an independent? And the second tier of that is, if you were elected and there is a hung parliament, who would you support and why?
I think a lot of people in this room, when Joshua Frydenberg was first elected to Parliament, had great hopes of him. 12 years later, he's had terms as the Minister for Energy, the Minister for the Environment, and the Treasurer. And he has, during that time, remained in a minority government which has been held to ransom by the National Party. That is not going to change if the Liberal National Party is re-elected on May the 21st. He has his own ambitions, which have resulted in him never crossing the floor during the 12 years of his parliamentary stay. As an independent, I'm coming to this role because I felt that I had to step up and try and take action on the existential threat to our planet. All of you here feel as strongly as I do, or more so, about that threat. As a citizen of Kooyong, I felt that I had to do something. I stepped away from a job that I loved and that I was good at and that was important because I felt that I had to do what I could. I know that if I'm elected to Parliament and I'm part of a group that has the balance of power, I will not be swayed by my personal ambitions, by factionalism, by backroom interests, in standing for what I think is important, which is integrity and honesty in government and effective, strong and immediate action on climate change.
And to the second part of the question?
Look, the reality is that if there were a hung parliament and Kooyong had a member who was a member of the crossbench in a hung parliament, that would be the best possible outcome for us as a community. Because if that person was me, you would know that you are going to get effective action on climate change in the next 6 months in this country, and you will get an ICAC. And that's the outcome I promise. And so I am a pragmatist. I will negotiate with both of the major political parties in order to secure those two outcomes. And the reality is that those things are achievable. They're quite conceivable, they're achievable. I would go so far as to say it's even probable that we might end up in that situation, and that would be great. It's not something to fear, it's something to anticipate.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from 3 of the candidates who are running. I understand that there are something like 11 candidates running in Kooyong. You've also heard a little bit of a reflection about the policies of the sitting member, Mr Josh Frydenberg, and the Liberal Party. There are scorecards available rating the various parties, which I know Lynn will tell you about at the end. I want to thank you for your attention, your engagement, your respect tonight for this process and for the difference of opinion and perspectives that we've heard. But I also want to ask you to thank the candidates for joining us and being part of an active democracy here tonight.
Authorised by Lighter Footprints Incorporated, Q, Victoria.